What is going on? We are back with the Vigor Life podcast, and I found this guy somewhere. Actually, he's in the U.S. We located him. But I'm so excited to have him on the show. Jordan Shallow, Muscle Doc, brother. It's a fucking honor and pleasure to have you on the show finally.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. I feel like we've crossed each other in airports or at the conferences so many times. Like, oh, hey, what up?
Yeah,
this is a long time in the making for sure.
For real. And I'll actually start with this too, because like if anybody, we wanted to also do the show before, because end of May we got Pre-Script level 1 in Seattle, which I'm fired up about. So if you haven't signed up for that, if you're anywhere in the Pacific Northwest, I mean, there's absolutely no excuse for you not to be there. This the only one in the U.S. this year, right? Or one of the only ones?
Yeah, it'll be the only one in the U.S. Next year, San Francisco. So we're scheduled out till 2025 right now. So there'll only be this opportunity. Yeah. And they've all been selling out, which has been great.
There you go. So be there. And that's, that's going to lead me into, because first of all, like if you haven't heard about Jordan, and you got to put it this way, you got to Google. We're not going to waste time. You know what I mean? Like you got to go Google him. But I know that most people listening know who Jordan is. And I kind of have some, I would say, selfish questions I want to dig into. And I mean, you've got so much, you got experience from chiropractic, from strength and conditioning, powerlifter yourself, and you work with a lot of, I would say, high-level athletes. So for me, like I've got this, I don't know, now people might even call it a niche, which I fucking hate, but it's like the athlete for life. That's honestly, it's what I believe myself to be, right? Like I'm about to be 42. I train hard. I like to, when I train with NFL guys, I like to do accelerations and jumps to make them feel like what the fuck is going on. And really, I wanted to ask you, in your mind, the principles. Okay, if somebody was going to, continue to pass their career, so in their 30s or 40s, still be strong, be jacked, but have athletic abilities, and I know it probably, I would say, is part of the principles that you believe in training anyways, but what would those be for you? If you were like, hey, I got this guy, this is what I'm going to build them into an athlete for life. They're 35, they're 38. They want to like feel like that and move like that, as long as they possibly can. Like, where do you go from there?
Yeah, I think identifying training as a skill, especially for those people who are coming out of let's call it like conventional athletic backgrounds, whether you're playing football, basketball, baseball, whatever, track and field. That one of the thing that detrains the quickest, and the thing that is the underpinning to athleticism on the whole, is our ability to process sensory input, not our capabilities to drive motor output, right? So someone might be athletic and they might have like a 4.4 40, and they balled for like 8-10 years in the league, and they made their money. And then they come out of it, and then, they're not practicing, or training in the off season. They're not getting prepared. And they might look at like the depreciation of their motor output as like the number one indicator of their lack of athleticism coming out of like a sporting career. But the thing that's 100-fold, 1,000-fold more detrimental and the thing that they're missing isn't the motor output of the running, the jumping, and the broad jumps and the agility lap, whatever. It's the sensory input of the game itself. Like that is what drives athleticism. And that is something, when we look to like replicate athleticism without having that Monday night, or that, that 4th and long, or that, the World Series or whatever, without that atmosphere, there are ways that we can look at training from a sensory input perspective that'll be the nucleus of what drives adaptation for someone who's so used to driving so much or adapting to so much sensory input. So I think too often we get lost in like, the metrics and the measurables of, DEXA scans and body fat percentage, or bench press repetitions, or time, or weight, or distance, and all these like great useful tools in strength and conditioning. But the one thing that we never look is like the subjective interpretation of the innumerable variables that an athlete will face in a split second, compute, make that decision, and then drive. The motor output that's nothing. Catching a ball, running a route, setting a pick, whatever. That's the actual motor output is the easy part. But in keeping that like idea of athlete for life, you got to understand how much sensory input athletes are dealing with. And that's really what's going to keep them sharp. Skills in the gym to someone who can, windmill, layup, dunk, 360, no look, over the shoulder, wilt the stilt, moonshot, hook, whatever. Like the bench press is like it's a thousandth of a component of one motor pattern in the sport of like basketball. So you need to figure out a way to stimulate that input first and foremost. And the way you do that is you look at exercises that have a skill component to it, that prioritize coordination, visual fixation. And they don't have to be in this one crazy amalgamated exercise, but understanding that there's so many components to athleticism that are so driven by inputs, right? Like rhythm, timing, coordination, tone, reflex. These are all components that we could just get washed over for like 3 sets of 8 this week, 3 sets of 10 next week. It's like, what? Like we're chimpanzees with universes for brains. That's an insane way to look at progression for someone who's, has been on, a field of play of any sort for any length of time.
Actually, that brings me to a great point though, because you got these kind of two ends of the spectrum, right? One side is like, man, I train hard at the gym. I do all these things. I progress. I got higher force outputs, blah, blah, blah. And great, but you're not putting these inputs that are actually necessary to make these adaptations. But then the other side of it is, I don't really do shit, but I show up for, pick up basketball once a week for an hour and a half, which is, I'm getting some inputs there, but that's not going to do it. Now the Achilles is gone. Now the knee is gone. Like how do you like molding those two together when it comes to somebody that's going like, look, how do we create optimal? It's just as good as we can to kind of keep both of those things.
Yeah. The software has to match the hardware, right? Like you can have a ton of computing power, but you can be in an empty vessel and it's not going to be able to enact, right? Like I think the difficult part is where we kind of get sold on this dualistic idea of like body and mind. It's like, they're not separate, right? Like our muscles, and this is like a hill that I'm willing to die on. Muscles are sensory organs, right? Just as much as a muscle is like a vehicle of force output, production, absorption, and transfer, it's equal parts, and in some cases greater part, a sensory organ. Right? Other than our eyes, which is like obviously as human beings, and like, I don't know, maybe like peregrine falcons and maybe large cats and snow owls might be like top 4 most visual creatures in the world. Like it's like I throw a orange tennis ball in green grass, my dog can't see shit. Might be able to smell it, right? But it's like, it's just kind of looking around, wagging its tail because it can't see it. But we're so visually dominant that's something that like we always need to factor in. We need to be able to understand like, how does that play into like the story of athleticism? Right? I'm going to, like, I completely sidebarred there, but that's something that I think as we kind of go on, like we're going to have to focus on the visual component and the rhythm component and the timing component, because those things are the cornerstone of athleticism. Because, the Achilles will snap if the foot's in a wrong position. But if we don't know where the foot is, it's more likely to end up in a bad position, right? So training, there is going to be, given like the energy systems at play, right? Like whether or not it's more anaerobic or more aerobic or more glycolytic or what, if it's 5-minute rounds, there's an underlying component of physiology that you can train towards and improve. But it's about figuring out based off of the continuum of skill and output in a sport, right? Like someone might look at, what would be a good example? Like a Tyson Fury, right? I think he's a good, because he's always gets ripped for having his shirt off and being like not shredded. But it's like boxing, if you look at someone like him, you would look at it like, well, boxing at that level is more about skill than about output, right? Because he's more skillful than he is, visibly athletic or having the attributes of someone who's, who might have like a high VO2 max, or all of these tangible things that we measure.
Like a great comparison, probably Anthony Joshua, like the look, the power, and then you got Gypsy King,
or
like
even Gypsy King's brother, shredded, right? Like it's like just but so like football, for example, like there's positions that are more output based and there's positions that are more skill based. So depending on the type of activity you're attempting to maintain or attain, You need to understand, well, if I'm training for that, there has to be equal, or not equal, but a proportionate amount of my training needs to reflect the amount of skill versus output in the sport that I'm training for, right? Like I work with a gold medal badminton player in Dubai, and it's like, I need to figure out where is he relative to skill of the sport versus output. Like some guys are just brute, right? They're all work. They're kind of like their skills are on the court and off the court are a little bit all over the place. And those are the guys that you need to like maybe train some more skill-based movements to try and get some low level, low intensity, low velocity coordination and timing and rhythm in a controlled setting, that as you turn up intensity and volume or velocity, they have a base to start from to be able to express this rhythm, coordination, timing, etc. But some people might be really skillful but have more output, right? Like if you're a smaller player and you get by with being slippery in the backfield as a wide receiver, but you're 165 pounds, it's like, all right, maybe we slant more towards the output side, right? You're very skillful as it is. Let's put you on a leg press rather than like a split squat or something, because we need you to drive output to put on tissue. So it always starts from an assessment, right? Like what are they lacking? What do they need? And then program towards that direction. But if we can understand movement as like a skill and output perspective, and kind of mirroring our earlier conversation about, look, skill can be looked at as having a heavier sensory input component, and output can be looked at as having a higher motor output component. We can start to meet people in the middle and really fine tune their training to dose each parts of these continuum effectively for where they're at and where they need to go for the sport that they're playing.
Yeah, I love that. And actually bringing that up, because I was listening to some previous shows that you did. I mean, I follow you anyways, but like just kind of getting ready for this. And I know that, why am I blanking on him right now? Strength coach for the Suns.
Corey Schlesinger.
Corey. Yes. Corey.
Yes.
Why am I blanking? And basically this micro dosing idea, and like, basically how you explained it, you look at an athlete, it's never just like, all right, we're going to do this. It's like, okay, essentially kind of put them in the buckets. Of course, everybody's individual, but they need this. Maybe we microdose this. Essentially, is that what you're doing when you're looking at, just a client / athlete, and then also what time of year it is, so on and so forth. But let's just zoom out and say there is no time of year, because this is a person that just wants to improve their athleticism and do things on a regular, but you're looking at that going, okay, this person needs more skill. So I got a piece of the pie, and that piece of the pie, there's going to be a bigger part that we kind of work on this skill level. And we're going to maybe they're super strong. They got all these, I would say, abilities. We just maintain those, or maybe we microdose them. Is that how you kind of look at that? From the 10,000 foot view?
Yeah. Especially in like an athleticism and all the things that fall under that umbrella. Like the idea would be about prioritizing the highest yield weighted variable. So what does that mean? It means, like, let's use an easy example. For a young athlete, like say we have someone in a college program that wants to go pro football. I know the highest yield weighted variable across all measurable components of athleticism is going to be strength across the board, right? Like if I can get a kid who squats 185 but needs to have a 40-inch vertical, if I can get him to squat 225, his vertical is going to go up, his broad jump's going to go up, his sprint time is going to be faster, maybe even some of like his conditioning metrics will go up. So it's about identifying like, well, what are physiologically the highest yield weighted variables, just as we know from like a human being perspective. And then second to that, where do they fit on that continuum? So like Saquon Barkley, I don't know, power clean like 405 in high school. So I might look at someone in high school and go, hey, the highest yield weighted variable for a young athlete is going to be general strength training. But when I see a kid power clean 405, I'm like, okay, we're good. Like we don't need to. It's funny. Like I draw a lot of comparison to the way like CrossFitters went about and still continue to go about preparing for like the CrossFit Games or regionals or whatever competition, because there's so specific in their subdisciplines and the way they organize their training that someone who might be a better like gymnast specialist might touch a little bit of gymnastics like further out from a might touch a little bit of gymnastics closer to the competition, but not really spend the entirety of their off season working on their strong points, right? They'll inadvertently have it sprinkled here and there. But if you're good at gymnastics and let's say not good at like Olympic weightlifting, you're probably going to start your programming and have this concerted wave of programming around the snatch and clean and jerk from 16 weeks out all the way into the competition, where you start to kind of flavor in the things you're good at as you work closer to the competition, because you don't really need to stoke those fires or keep those balls in the air. So when you look at training, I guess it first helps to understand like what are trainable adaptations, number one, because I think some people might even lose the plot on that. Like, oh, you know, some people like, I want to train for like a vertical jump. But it's like, well, what is that really in the language of the body? Like, what is the mechanism that allows that? Because it could be different, right? Like some people might actually need tendon stiffness, right? That they don't have stiff enough ankles to really transfer force effectively into the ground. So it's being able to like, what is the mechanism? Because I think in strength and conditioning, just like general fitness training, if you don't understand mechanisms and what's actually trainable, you kind of turn into a dog that's barking at a closed door. It's like, if you bark long enough and loud enough, the door will open. But we know there are a few people in the world that know how doors actually work. We can sit there and be like, oh, silly dog, and then open the door. But it's like when you lock your keys at the crib, then it's like, oh, actually, I don't know how doors work, right? Some guy with like a rap sheet and felony charges shows up with a credit card and an ice pick, and then like opens the door in 3 seconds. And you're like, that motherfucker, no, that guy knows how doors work, right? Because he understands mechanistically, like, I don't know, how to move the tumblers in the barrel to disengage the mechanism and then, you know, open the door. You got to be at that level where it's like, or aim to be at that level, because something as simple as like, I want to be more agile. It's like, well, what's your limitation mechanistically for why you can't express that as like a understood property in training? Because, you know, agility and vertical jump and, you know, top end speed or acceleration, all of these things can be extracted down to like very specific stimulus response adaptation implementations. And if you don't understand those subcategories, you're just kind of like reaching at exercise. You're just kind of barking, hopefully loud enough and long enough that something happens, right? And the nice part about the human body is it's not a zero-sum game. So like, yeah, enough volume and effort has seen people so far in adaptation. But if you're really trying to, you know, like optimize, and that becomes a more useful endeavor, the better you are at something, then this is the level that you kind of want to get to, is like, okay, assess what is it that you're missing mechanistically. Okay, why your vertical jump's not good? Well, why? Because it's not like necessarily a vertical jump problem. Is it a technical problem? Is it like a tendon stiffness problem? Is it a strength to weight or force velocity issue? Like, all of these things need to be considered. And just by digging a little bit deeper mechanistically at what are the things that we can actually in relative isolation change as a property of human physiology, biomechanics, that will express as a outcome that you're looking for.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, put it this way, for most people, because like bucketing it and going like, look, you need to train how to absorb force better. You need to, you know, here are some exercises to do this. And the thing is, I get it too, like from a standpoint of, man, if you got, and you work with athletes that are millions of dollars, and then that becomes in same thing. Like I got a bunch of, you know, high level MFL guys, and it's like, there's a lot more going into that, going like, oh shit, okay. You know, first of all, I'm not going to do anything dumb. What's the highest rate of return I can get, especially when you get a call and it's like, I got 6 weeks. I don't know if you get those, but you know, it's like, all right, cool. But, you know, again, like because what I see for a lot of people that don't, you know, that example of, well, I go to the gym a little bit and then I go play pickup basketball, but I want to be better and I want to, you know, be more athletic. And, you know, then you talk to them about what else they do in the gym. It's like, they don't do anything that will prepare their tissues. And I know that you kind of get sometimes triggered by this. I actually want to talk to you about that, like tissue tolerance. Oh yeah, baby. But you know, that's like, what are you doing that's actually preparing you for the task? You know, and what was some of those, and I know this is general, but still, you know, when you look at most people that are like, hey, like I want to play, you know, flag football, you know, box recreationally, go and play basketball. The things that, what are just like some really, really high ROI things that folks could be doing that they're not doing? And then we'll go to the tissue tolerance part, because I really want to dig into that actually with you.
Yeah, I think it'll segue nicely. So I think the number one thing that people should focus on, even if they have a prior training background or don't, is, so I'll use the word stability, but I'm going to have to contain the shit out of it with context, because it goes the wrong ways. It goes off the rails in a few dimensions. So like, the reason I lean on the word stability like often is stability to me is just a surface level language I use to refer to proprioception. Now, proprioception is another bastardized term, and it's like, it's fine. Like, unless you're like knee deep in anatomy textbooks and neurophysiology textbooks, like I don't expect anyone to know these definitions like off the top of their head. But so when I say stability, I mean putting someone in a position where a center of mass is deviating outside of base of support. So a muscle contraction occurs reflexively and not as a conscious forethought, like involuntarily rather than voluntary. That's like a very high level definition. When I say stability, those are like loose parameters as to what I expect an exercise to contain in varying degrees, right? Because it can go too far, right? Like I don't need people back squatting on a Swiss ball. Like that's not actually the adaptation I'm trying to drive. Like that will actually limit the stimulus that I'm looking for. But something basic, like if we're trying to make this actionable, like I think a walking lunge and a single leg RDL with some very attainable objective criteria, where it's like we're dynamically deviating the base of, or the center of mass of the athlete while changing their interaction with their base of support. That can tell us a lot about their understanding of where they are in space, which is really when we dig down to proprioception at its core, and stability drills being hopefully contained effectively by loadable deviation of center of mass outside of base support. What we're looking at is we're looking for like reflexive muscle contractions that help automatically or autonomically keep someone's center of mass over their base of support. Outwardly facing, we just say, okay, stable or not, or more or less. But what we're doing there is whenever we see, like, let's do a single leg RDL. This is like commonly misinterpreted. Very like, could be a very basic exercise. A lot going on. It is at its core a like frontal plane exercise. In order for me to stand on one leg, I need to move my pelvis to the side. Because if I keep my pelvis in the same place to stand on one leg, my other leg just falls down, and I can't stand on the leg, right? So in order to adopt my center of mass over a limited base support or stand on one leg to even initiate a single leg RDL, I need to have a strategy to move my pelvis somewhere so that all my, the net forces acting in and on my body in that position, which is the definition of center of mass, are over my base support, which is the single foot I'm trying to stand on. So I need to adopt a strategy. Now, some strategies are more effective than others. And the best one that you could probably shoot for is a frontal plane movement. Like my pelvis moves to the side of my foot that's on the ground. But some people will like shoot their butt back. Some people will like bend their knee a little bit more. So it's very telling of how someone completes that task, what their preferred strategy is. Because if it's their preferred strategy, standing still for a zero amount of time under, no intensity or no load and at no speed or no velocity, as we start to layer in these progressions of endurance, these progressions of intensity or load, these progressions of speed or velocity, you're just going to see that little neurological goat path get carved and paved more and more and more. They're going to lean into that bias of how they move standing still, right? For no duration, no intensity, and no velocity. That's going to be their default path of least resistance that they're going to take as we ascend through those other progressions, right? Of time, load, and velocity. So as someone goes into like, okay, we've figured out a way, maybe not the best way, we've sorted out a way to stand on one leg. Great. And we begin to hinge over. You'll notice a few things. People who don't have this stability will not extend the opposite hip. Their foot, the second it's out of sight, will no longer be extended. Be a byproduct of their hip extending. So like they kind of hinge a little bit, their foot's behind them, they can't see it. And then they just start flexing their spine. Mm-hmm. The foot doesn't go up to the ceiling as the same pace that the hands approach the floor. They just kind of like round in the spine. One of the reasons is that they have no idea where their foot is anymore. It's because if we're not training, and without going too deep into like the specifics of the neuroscience, but if we're not training the sensory organ component of a muscle, the hip of the foot that's on the ground is a strong signal to our brain of where our foot on our other leg is going to be, right? Because it can tell the relative orientation of the femur and the pelvis and the spine and kind of be like, okay, based off of this, we can we can assume that the coordinate of the foot is in X degree of extension on the other leg. But if you don't train that, or if you train it improperly, so if you don't actually use like your lateral hip rotators or your glute med or your piriformis or whatever to begin to calibrate your position of center of mass over your base support, and in doing so, cause like a reflexive contraction. Like I always think of if I, if I was in the gym, I would use a dowel, but I'm at my desk, so I'll use a pen. I guess I always do this example where it's like, if I take this pen, right, and I place it kind of on my hand, just like if I were to have a dowel, and I would say, okay, and this is indicative of what happens with like the foot and the leg in an RDL. If I try to like keep this to stand up, I struggle sometimes because it's like, it's trying to, well, like I can't keep it straight. Well, it's like the pen is the leg and the hand is the foot. So you'll see a lot of people as they hinge, their foot's just doing this, right? Like it's just shaking all over the place. And you're like, what the hell is going on here? It's like, that's actually their hip musculature turning on and off to try and calibrate this, right? It's trying to calibrate the center of mass to stay over the base of support. And it's like, if you take like a free throw, for example, everyone has like their own way of going about it. That's a motor pattern that's in your pre and primary motor cortex in your brain. I look at it like a zip folder. You have like a bunch of, I'm sure you're the same. You have like a bunch of zip folders that you have with like media and videos that's too big to like store on your computer, but you have to send it and all this stuff. So you like unzip it and zip it and files, whatever. That's like kind of how like a free throw would work. So you have this like part of your brain that like Dropbox. You have a Dropbox in your brain for like shit that you do. And the shit that you do more often, like you call on and it's easier and it zips and unzips. And it's like a free throw for you is probably like, okay, yeah, no problem. For me, it's like this dusty old thing in the back of my brain that like some guy with a flashlight is like looking around my like pre and primary motor cortex, like, what is this thing? And then he like dusts it off and he deploys like, I don't know, like wrist flexion, elbow extension, shoulder flexion, probably like plantar flexion, a knee extension, hip extension. So all these different things just like co-contract. And we take for granted like how amazing it is that that's even possible. But anyways, besides the point, when we do that, all of the muscle contractions that tie into shooting a free throw started here, in the probably more like here, like parietal lobe. When I'm standing on one leg, the muscle contractions that are occurring at my hip that are causing my foot to kind of like oscillate and trying to like catch this femur and tibia and fibula that are kind of just going all over the place, that muscle contraction starts in the hip because the muscle is a sensory organ. So like the sensory component of the muscle goes right to the local level of the spinal cord and says, hey, we're lengthening or shortening, deviating either towards or away from the center of mass, contract or relax accordingly. And as it closes that loop, it also loops up to the brain to be like, hey, can we sort this out long-term? So it would be really useful as biped ambulatory creatures to know where my foot is in relation to my hip. So it's like this idea of like neural sharpening or neural polishing. So over time, like, yeah, I mean, if I can do a single leg RDL with my eyes closed, I could do it with weight. I can do it with barbells or kettlebells or landmines or med balls, whatever, because that loop between the sensory organ of my muscle and essentially the cerebellum, which that's a whole nother that's too long for a podcast, I think. But that pathway is paved and it goes, oh, he's on one leg. Okay, boom. He needs to be in this position if he's on one leg. Right. Oh, he's on one leg and he has a dumbbell in one hand. Okay. Make the relative adjustment of tone at that muscle. Right. So when we look at high yield returns, to kind of circle back and answer your question, stability drills. Now let's like to name a couple. Execution is going to matter. Obviously, it matters in the way we do a bench press. It matters in the way we do a back squat. It's going to matter in the way we try to drive this particular adaptation. But if I had to give like a recommendation, walking lunges, single leg RDLs, hip airplanes, kettlebell bottom under press, and windmill, if I had to kind of assess someone's ability of, do you know where you are in space? I would do that. I would probably stick with those 4 or 5 exercises, 3 lower body, 2 upper body. That's going to give me a pretty good idea of whether or not you have those reflex loops locally at the muscle and globally into this somatosensory cortex, but primarily cerebellum. If you have those well trained, you can figure it out. Then you're an athlete, because if you know where you are, you can learn anything, right? And that's knowing where you are is the prerequisite to knowing where you need to go. So good athletes learn really quickly because they have a very well established baseline of where they are. And it's like, if I know where I am in relation to becoming a polymath, I'll get there as fast as possible because I need to figure out how to do multiplication, not on my fingers. And I'll start there. But if my goal is to prove string theory, and I want to start at some sort of advanced calculus or something like that, it's like, well, you do math on your hands, you idiot. Like, you can't possibly, you'll never get anywhere. And I think that's where a lot of people miss the athleticism boat, is really being able to strip down to that base unit of do you know where you are? Like, when your eyes are closed and you're actually using the second most abundant sensory organ and closing that loop from input to output, that is fundamentally where I think everyone should start.
You know what's so interesting as you're speaking about this, and when it comes to training and doing stuff at the gym, I swear this might have many years ago you were talking about this. And I've had some injuries from sports and lifting and shit like that, some really bad back stuff. And at one point in time, I just started, and I think I was listening to you on this years ago, and I was like, all right, I'm going to start doing single leg work before I do bilateral work. Right. And kind of to piggyback on what you're talking about. I have not left that. Now, and the thing is, legitimately, I'm basically close to PRing lifetime in certain bilateral lifts. And all I do, I never start with bilateral lift in my training session. And it feels fucking phenomenal. Right. And it's like I started preaching this to other people. I'm do try it. People are like, oh, I'll be fatigued, for my bilaterals. And it doesn't happen to me. But I think that part of what you're talking about too, just having stability in the brain, being you know what? Hey, okay, I'm a check mark. You're allowed to produce force, a lot of it. And then when I go to something that's bilateral, not only do I feel better, my hips feel better, my back feels better, everything feels better, I am actually able to produce more force. I mean, I've tested this shit out on so many people now, as in a fucking thought experiment, and it's working. But what, even is that something that you're I do that with people in general, because it does, multiple things. One of them, which is what you're just talking about right now, it's like an assessment, right? An assessment that you progress.
Every time it's like a gatekeeper to load. For me, because it gives me an indication of, okay, so when we resist force inside our body, we can do it with a few ways. We can do it with what I'll say function, which is in reference to muscles and tendon, or we can do it with structure, which is more passive tissues. Mm-hmm. Bones would be the most representative of a passive tissue in the body. Then then you get into ligaments and cartilage and things like that. But if I can't stand on one leg and hinge, and I can't control that with my obliques and my transverse to a certain degree, and my adductors and my abductors to a certain degree, if I can't do that and hinge on one leg, and then I go with two legs and try and pick up 300 kilos, I'm making a certain concession. Now, we're resilient, structurally resilient, but that resiliency has a shelf life, and I'd prefer it to not expire before I expire. And so it's if I go through a single leg RDL, I'm shaking all over the place, but all of a sudden when I put my other leg next to it and I hinge, I obviously don't see that instability. It's well, I'm probably relying on the structure to resist more of the force, because clearly in that isolated single leg hinge, I'm trying to actually isolate the muscle's capability in that moment in time to resist force. And if the muscle is not showing me a state of physiological preparedness, I'll either keep addressing it until it can show me that, or I'll change the movement. Right? If I'm going to squat and I can't stand on one leg or do a lunge without falling over, it's well, I'm probably making a few concessions in loading inert soft tissues at my ankle, definitely my knee joint, potentially my hip labrum, lumbar spine, intervertebral disc, and so on and so forth. So if I look at that, and I just, I travel a lot. And there's times where I get off planes where it's just I got an hour, I get off a plane, I do a couple single leg RDLs, some walking lunges, and then I get under a bar, I move a bit. I'm okay, it doesn't really feel good. Lunges are still kind of shaky. It's look, I got an option. I can do single leg RDLs and trying to, minimize some of this fatigue and try and find some level of preparedness. Or I can sit on a leg press today, knowing that I'm not going to be able to stabilize internally with my muscles, not wanting to stabilize internally with my structure, my labrum, intervertebral disc, and all the things I just listed. I'm going to delegate that stability to a leg press. My spine, my hip, all that will be stabilized externally. It's going to give me some reference, like it's going to kind of push me, and I'm going to feel it, and I'm going to use mechanoreceptors to start to fill in this picture of where I am in space. And then I'm just going to drive output there. And then next week, when I come in under better lifting conditions, I can ramp up if I'm showing a level of like neurological preparedness for that exercise, because it's never a line that we calibrate from. And if you're not qualitatively assessing as a coach, you're just guessing.
Yeah.
Right. It's all kind of guessing. Like there's so many variables, but it's like, that is really our job. Like, that's why, with, technology and edge recognition technology and neural network convolutions and all of these fitness wearables, it's like, that's great, but they don't know how to interpret what's better or worse. And that's where we come in. So I can say, yeah, like, hey, that looks good. Let's load today. Hey, that's looking a little shaky. Let's do another round. See how you look. Okay. You know what? We're going to pull the option. Maybe I go from back squat to front squat. Maybe I go from back squat to leg press. All of these things are just considerations of a subjective interpretation of your physical, neurological preparedness to load.
See, great. I mean, this is actually a great segue to, I promise I'll come back to tissue tolerance, but segue to like just exercise selection. Cause I'll just use myself as an example, or two people come to mind that I trained that kind of had a former high level sports career and, pretty damn beat up. And I'll do the same thing, but now the exercise selection is like barbell squat is not even on the list. Right. But here's what we do have, right? We got a front squat, double kettlebell squat, belt squat, pendulum squat. And obviously choice becomes, what are we trying to achieve here? Is that because, again, you work with, I don't know if you work with also some guys that have been in the league for a long time, and then younger guys, some people that are like, fuck no, like I'm not doing any of that shit. Like, you kind of go through that as well, where it's like, obviously you see where they're at, how prepared they are, but they go, okay, you make a decision on, well, these aren't even in the equation. And maybe it's part of it is because of choice. I've had that where I've got guys that make, 10, 20 million. And they're like, I hurt myself years ago with this thing. I ain't fucking touching it. Right. Like, yeah. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, all right, we're going to find another option. Like, but how do you approach that? Like, again, whether it's preference of the person or you make that decision and go like, yo, that guy just should not be loaded in this way because they've just been through a lot of shit.
Yeah, I look at it. So I book a lot of Airbnbs. I've like for 4 years, I lived on the road and I lived exclusively in Airbnb. So I'm like a wizard at booking Airbnbs. And so there's a filtering criteria and an indexing system. And there's a couple ways that we can look at this, but I'll go with the Airbnb. So Airbnb has 6 million properties across the world. The highest concentration of properties in a single city is London, England. There's 56,000. I'm in the process of looking at some for next year, literally as we speak. It's the
fact that you know this is phenomenal to me, by the way.
It's just part of my psychosis. This is a bug, not a feature. But so there's 56,000 in London proper. That's just an incredible amount of data to sift through. Right. Because it's like, what do I need? It's like, well, I'm going to need Wi-Fi. I have a couple of gyms I really like training at, probably a proximity in one of those neighborhoods. I'm going to need air conditioning regardless of time of year. I don't care if it's in the winter. I'm going to probably need a washer and dryer from there for a bit. If I rent a car, I'm going to need parking. All of a sudden, 56,000 is like, if you cut it down by geographical region and all those filtering criteria, maybe it's like 10. Then it's like, all right, I know how Airbnb works. Sometimes when they say washer and dryer in the building, it's like the thing is on top of a laundromat and you got to go down. It was like, well, it's in the building. It's like, God, you son of a bitch. So I'm going through pictures now and I'm like, I want to see a Maytag inside. Like, but I don't care if it's in Europe and it's in the kitchen. That's weird, but Europeans just get that for some reason. And then, or I just need to see a closet. I'm looking for that picture. And then all of a sudden 10 turns down to like 2. All right. Oh, this one's got a king size bed. They don't let you filter that by criteria, but you can see it when you look through it. Like, all right, 1 room, king size bed. Okay. Fuck bet. I'm on that. And so all of a sudden it's like, boom, I have 1 Airbnb that I can pick. Decision made. Right. But the thing is, like, in training, we have such broad I'm going to use the word taxonomy, and I'm going to kind of change the analogy momentarily to like animals and genetics and zoologists. It's like, so I'll use a spider example. I've spent a lot of time in Australia, so I'm okay with spiders now. But like, I was in Africa. When was it? I think Africa, like last August or July or something. And there was a spider, but that's not enough information. There's a daddy long leg that lives next to my toilet. His name's Gary. I talk to it when I'm on the can. It's like, because it's just like, it's a spider, sure, but it's a daddy long leg. So like, I don't really care. But if there's a spider in Kenya, I need to know if that's like a fucking, I don't know, like a brown recluse spider or something, right? So when you look at like an exercise, or when you look at like a taxonomy system, right? Like if you look at, I don't know, what do you look? There's like kingdom, phylum, class, subclass, genus, species, all these different ways of like breaking up a spider. And you look at those two things. You look at like a daddy long leg, and you look at a brown recluse spider. Kingdom, I have this up on my screen. So if those of you who aren't watching, don't think I'm also like a low-key zoologist and travel agent. So like, I don't know. I was like trying to explain this to someone the other day, and I wanted to be specific. So luckily I have it here. So both spiders, brown recluse, which for those of you unfamiliar, great. I think they're actually fairly prominent in like the American Midwest. They're not super violent, but if they attack you, like you'll have like a flesh-eating disease and you go into like kidney failure and die. So it's like not great if you get bit by one. And daddy long legs are just, things that live in your shower, right? So kingdom, Animalia, the same for both. Phylum, Arthropoda, same for both. Subphylum, Chelocerata, same for both. Class, Arachnida, same for both. Order, Arnea, same for both. Infraorder, Arnemophia, maybe, same for both. And it's not until we get down to the subclassification of genus and species that they start to differ. So it's like if we just look at exercise, like it's a dumbbell exercise that trains the hamstring. It's like, that's not enough to be actionably different, right? So without that level of depth of understanding, like, hey, what are the differences between these two things? It's like, then everything's the same, right? Like that doesn't change the way I act, knowing those two data points. If the two data points I got were, it's in the Animalia kingdom and the phylum is Arthropoda, but okay. There's probably like a million things that are in that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like maybe it's even more than spiders. Like, do you know that cows and whales are closely genetically related than cows and horses? Even though you see cows and horses next to each other like all the time, the thing in the ocean is actually like way closer genetically related to the cow than it is to the horse that stands next to it. Isn't that crazy? But if you look at like ways of taxonomizing an exercise, I see trainers stand next to like lying hamstring curls all the time. Someone's on it, or seated hamstring curls and someone's on it. And they go, well, we'll just do the lying hamstring curl instead. It's like, a dumbbell RDL is closely related to the seated hamstring curl than it is to the prone hamstring curl. So even though it's in the dumbbell section, if we look at length tension relationships, like an RDL is going to train the lengthened hamstring, a seated hamstring curl is going to train the lengthened hamstring. Those two things, albeit in different places, are actually closer related. Right. So you need to have like a depth of analyzing exercises that brings you to a level that creates or incites meaningful action. And it's not until I get to genus L. loxurceles or whatever, species L. reclusa, that I'm like, oh shit, I'm going to like go into kidney failure if this thing bites me. Or if it's Phocida and Phoceus, oh, it's a daddy long leg, I'm going to just keep taking a shit. Like but if we just go like, it's a hamstring exercise, it's a rotator cuff exercise, it's like, well, yeah, a fucking dumbbell front raise is a rotator cuff exercise, but it indexes alongside being an anterior delt exercise and being a sagittal plane shoulder flexion exercise. And on the eccentric component, it could be seen as like a deceleration. Like I'll use a front raise or like even a kettlebell swing as like a part of my rehab for something that's called like a Bankart lesion, which is basically like an avulsion of the posterior or bulging of the labrum by the long-headed tricep. I need someone to be able to decelerate, right? So it's like on the way down, it's a different taxonomization. But if you only look at it through like, hey, this is a dumbbell raise and it trains the delt, it's like, what? No, there's so many other things, but you need to know what those other things are, right? Because then you get to index exercises, right? Just like a phone book. Fuck, how many analogies deep am I right now?
Oh man.
So like if you look at a phone, hopefully this ties together, but if you look at a phone book, it's like, I don't need if I need to find an auto body shop, I don't need to also be looking next to like my neighbor's phone number, right? So there's white pages and yellow pages. Some people are probably like, what the fuck is a phone book?
No, dude, this is like, it's great because I think it's an importance, especially for coaches. And I would say that this podcast, there's a lot, I mean, I would say predominantly coaches, a lot of coaches that listen to it. And I think shining a light on that to go like, hey, you got to, and look, this might trigger you, but it's like, you got to be better than that. You got to be better than fucking like, all right, well, this just trains the hamstrings. Cause that means that like, if you were in somewhere, you know, I don't know, a professor at the university talking about spiders, literally you'd only go like 3 layers deep and that would be a problem.
Yeah. And if we're a coach dealing with a, you know, $111 million asset, and you don't know that, you know, the function of a hamstring is to also act to assist the ACL in resisting anterior tibial translation. And guess what? The fucking butcher of a surgeon that he went to fix his ACL grafted his semimembranosis and semitendinosis. Like, you don't know how to dose exercise properly. You don't realize, oh, it's got quad atrophy because it's got a little Harry Potter scar on the front of his knee. It's like, dude, it's not going to be the quad that trips him up and re-tears it. It's going to be the fact that he doesn't have his first line, little shit like that. You don't have a first line of defense. They tore into a fucking hamstring, graft the other patella like a normal person. All of that shit, like, because you don't want that phone to ring and be like, yo, what the fuck did you do? Right? Like, and rightfully so. Like, yo, the homeboy's making generational wealth. Like, you don't want his grandkids to work, right? Keep him in the game, man. But it's like, yeah, dumbbell, hamstring, whatever. It's like, you need to know the difference between, you know, just mechanistically, right? So, you know, being able to index exercises up like appropriately and like understanding what is in the white pages, what is in the yellow pages, what is, you know, what are adaptations we can make and what are the tools we can use to make them? And then what are our limitations on using those tools based off of preference or loadability or, you know, time constraints or learning curve, skill versus output. It's like all of these things. Then you're just filtering Airbnb criteria again, or filtering through a phone book, right? So it's just like, you know, I think a lot of people, when they use like exercise progression models, is they just start at A, right? Like bird dog curl up side plank. It's like a homeboy anti-rotates human beings and you're going to get him on all fours. Are you joking me? Like, he's posting up brawn and you're going to make him do a bird dog. Like, what are you doing? It's like looking for shallow in the phone book by flipping to the first page. That's such a silly thing to do. Like, get an idea of all those filtering criteria and where they might be at on those indexes and how those indexes intersect, and then start flipping through pages, man. Like, making better decisions quickly is how you're going to make bread in this industry. So if you're just like starting on some generic, like, here's the protocol, it's like, okay, all right, see you in the unemployment line, man. When like ChatGPT takes your job, because it's not feasible. Like, you have to be able to take some risks, assess, be self-aware, understand what you're seeing, learn from your previous interactions, and then just like manage load by exercise selection relative to all the variables that limit someone from learning a skill. That's it.
Man, that's a great, I'm going to say that again, what you said, which is to make better decisions quickly, which means that you have to get fucking really good at it. And you got to have, put it this way, you have to have experience. So you got to get the reps in, but you got to understand the principles. You got to understand, I would say, the whys be at the bottom and not just the methods at fucking the top or the tactical stuff. Big point, which honestly, this like leads well into this, because I really wanted to ask you this question. I've heard you talk about it on a number of shows, which is just the tissue tolerance thing. I say thing because what's your thought about it, right? Because you'll have like, oh man, you know, he had an injury because we didn't build up the tissue tolerance to that specific muscle or whatever it may be. And I've heard you talk about how like your perspective on that it's more complex than that, number one, but that you kind of get bugged when people just say that word and bucket it.
Sorry, my dog's going AWOL. I'm trying to like limit the amount of background noise. So tissue tolerance, it's too often we look at, and look, you go to a physical therapist, you ask for directions, and you're leaving with like a you know, photographed, or it's not photographed, a photocopied stick figure drawing of something. It's like, oh, like you have like a weak VMO, or like your rotator cuff is weak, or your core is weak. And it's like, okay, sure. But that's like a very two-dimensional way of looking at like biomechanics. Actually, it's not biomechanics at all. Like when we start to draw these stick figures and we start to be like, oh, like, well, the knee is being loaded too much, and the moment arm is this, therefore like we need to increase the tissue tolerance of the patella tendon or quad tendon or whatever. And so you start doing like bandage VMO terminal knee extensions. It's like, what like that makes, so I always think I grew up pretty close to Detroit, basically in like Canadian Detroit. And I had a client when I was younger, and he was like affiliated with a motorcycle gang, and he would show up. He was a great client because he would pay cash for a year, $10,000, 5 sessions a week for hour-long sessions. I was like 19 years old. I'm like, this is amazing. And then, as in a commercial gym, you're bringing home like 20% of that. But this guy would just like show up on a Hayabusa, and he would just pay, and sometimes he would show up, sometimes he didn't, but he's like always just charged me for the session. And I remember one series of weekends, 3 weekends in a row, he texted me on Sunday night about our Monday session, and he's just like, oh man, sorry, I can't make it in. Got stabbed last night. 3 weekends in a row. This guy went to the same bar and got stabbed 3 separate occasions.
Dude, that's a fucking schedule, by the way.
Yeah, it's, occupational hazard, let's call it. So we, at no point, and this is what trainers do when they look at tissue tolerance as being like the way out of pain. At no point did I ever tell him like, hey man, like you ever think of wearing like chainmail when you go to the bar, or like wrap yourself in like phone books or something? Like that would be such a dumb idea. But when we look at injuries, you can look at an injury as applied force greater than tissue tolerance, which it is. And whether it's a laceration or whether it's a herniation or a dislocation, there's an applied force that's greater than the tissue tolerance. But in like the rehab training hybrid space, so often we just go gung-ho on like improving the tissue tolerance. It's like without ever asking like the high level, high dimensional biomechanical question. It's like, why were we applying so much force there to begin with? Right? Like, why did force converge at the patella tendon? Why did force converge at the anterior talofibular ligament? Why did force converge at an intervertebral disc in the spine? Then you start to look at like, well, movement doesn't follow these straight lines like in a free body diagram like you're taught in like classical biomechanics. It follows electrical impulse. It follows the path of least resistance, like a lightning bolt from our brain. It just sort of finds the way to complete the task. And sometimes if we're not training properly, and there's a lot of asterisks around the word properly, or if we establish patterns or paths of least resistance that load through like less resilient tissues, we can look to make those tissues more resilient. But if we don't focus on why it is we're applying force to them to begin with, then those tissues are just, we're kicking the can down the road biomechanically of just when that tissue is going to become intolerant, right? Like the forces, like it would be like my friend. My advice wasn't to, wear a vest or wear chainmail or phone books so he didn't get stabbed. My advice was, don't go to Polishers or Don Cherry's on Polisher Avenue, right? It's like decrease the applied force and you'll have to less worry about the tissue tolerance. So that's where I think a lot of people just look at biomechanics one-dimensionally, in that equation one-dimensionally. And it's like, if you consider that, be like, hey, why are we applying so much force here? What can be done about rerouting that path of least resistance? Then we can start to make better training decisions. And we can kind of, not to say there's not places for terminal knee extensions, but it's a lot further regressed than where I see most of the time it being applied.
Got it. So, I mean, and that would be, I don't know, an example comes just because I'm staying in the ball space, right? And maybe this is a generic example, but Durant, I don't know, pops his Achilles tendon, but doesn't really have hip extension. So, the calf and Achilles become an extensor and they just can't handle that load. But it's like, we could go back to the Achilles and go like strengthen. But it's like, yeah, but that's not going to solve the problem long-term. Like you got to look at something else. Right.
Yeah.
And so with that said too, like what are some, I mean, look, like you have a lot of these, and I mean, shit, I'm in that boat too, right? As you get older and you're like, hey, I want to fucking feel a certain way, look a certain way, but I don't want to be, I mean, the term is going to be beat up, right? What becomes the thing for you when you kind of look over that and go like, does anything change? You know what I'm saying? Like as you're training and you're getting older, does anything change to like save the joints? Like like from 20 to 40 to 50. Now, look, I have my own opinion just from my own experience and all the people that I've trained and whatnot, but like, still, like, I just would love to see, like, hear you see your perspective on that part. Like, what changes for you when you're training somebody like that?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll group myself into that bucket of like what changes. I think a lot of it is understanding the biggest constraint to exercise or loadability is the exercise that we choose, right? So what do I mean by that? I think personal trainers should be like banned if they ever use, and I'm guilty of this, so maybe don't do that because I'll have to go back in time and ban myself from the industry. But like, what it takes to actually drive change. Like, I have clients who, you know, they live hectic lives, and like, not athletes, like, you know, people who are in show business and things like that. And, you know, the concerns they have and the goals they have and the lifestyle they live are so far apart that it's like, look, Doc, you're not going to get bulky. And frankly, if you keep going out twice a week in New York City, you're not going to get shredded. So it's like, you're not like, you know, hey, does this yogurt versus that yogurt matter? It's like, no, it doesn't, because you fucking tie one on 3 times a week. So it doesn't matter. So when it comes to like longevity and like, look, biomechanics is load management. That's essentially what it is, right? That's really, at the end of the day, why we know all. Now it's in depth, like finding these paths of least resistance to be like, hey, let's do this exercise so we underload this tissue and overload that one, because that's a more recoverable, more capable tissue to be loading through, all the way down to like, you shouldn't be allowed to say the words, we're going to go light today. And I hear it all the time, like, oh, we're just going to go light today, right? Like, I can't do that with a guy who's like, you know, he's traveling 3 or 4 times a week. He's tying one on. He's, you know, he's got this very social life. He's in Hollywood and all this crap. What it's going to take for me to actually drive meaningful change with our training is balls to the wall every single time he's in there. But it doesn't have to be heavy. It has to be hard. And there are times where the stimulus we need is heavy, and subjective interpretation will likely align that it is also hard. But like, you need to teach them how to work within their confinements of recoverability. So what does that mean? It's like, well, I had a client once who's a cardiothoracic surgeon at Stanford, and he would either show up after a shift or after like 4 days off, kind of work like firefighters. He would work in like the ICU or like the trauma ward. And sometimes he went into like a 17-hour surgery once, like wore diapers, the whole 9 yards. Just like really impressive person. Now that guy who comes to the gym after a 17-hour surgery versus the guy who's coming off of 4 days, takes his dog up to Napa, chills, that guy I would give the same exercise to, but on the surgery days, I would tell him to go light. And then on the 4-day post Napa, I would tell him to go heavy. What I started to do, as I started to like pull my head out of my ass, was on the surgery days, I put him on a leg extension and a split squat. And then on the non-surgery Napa days, I put him on a barbell back squat. Because it's like, if biomechanics is load management can be most accurately adjusted, or load can be most accurately adjusted by the constraint of the exercise that we choose. So rather than having him do a back squat but have him go light and ruin like the subjective intensity and hard work, it's like, I'm going to put him in a situation where he's sitting down, and then I'm just going to bury him. I'm always going to bury him. It's always RPE 10. It's just how loadable the exercise is, especially with someone who's like maybe doesn't have an extensive training background, who doesn't have like the mental fortitude to push into true physiological muscular failure. Like, I've been doing this for, I don't know, 18 years, training like as a primary focus in my life. And I could probably say, I can count on 2 hands how many times I've actually reached failure in an exercise. And that's been my waking preoccupation for 18 years. So like, I really need to make sure that this guy touches a proximity to failure, but I need to do it in a smart way that is managing load at a high level just by the exercise that we choose. And a lot of people just go, oh, you know, you feel this way, we're going to like auto regulate and 3 RPE or reps in reserve, whatever. And it's like, no, if you feel the need to do that, do an exercise that will load them with less weight and then work them to an inch of their life. It's like, that's how you're going to get results. If you're just going light, is just, you might as well just start looking for new clients.
Dude, I fucking love this. By the way, this part is gonna get chopped out for sure, in a good way. I mean, I'm
Oh,
talking
good
with the
way. All right,
subtitles.
we'll see this on
Oh
the
yeah,
ground. Yellow
oh yeah,
Texas, bitch.
hell yeah. Oh no, man, I love that. I mean, that's my same philosophy, because again, it's funny you said it. I legitimately have a vascular surgeon that used to work in like emergency rooms and basically save people's lives that were shot or stabbed. And now, but now he's kind of like more elective. Like, all right, I do 4 or 5 in a day. They're not as and legitimately, his results have skyrocketed, partially because, of course, more rest, more recovery. We still bury him. We bury him in different ways, just like you said. But I think that's a good analogy and approach of it, because again, like if you're over time, you're like, man, these things bug me. Okay, make better exercise choices, but you can still train your ass off.
Yeah.
Okay, so from there, here's one. I'm actually interested. I'm always like, what are you right now, like really, really curious about in studying? And it could be a couple of different things, but like, I'm curious about what you're curious about, because I'm always studying shit. But like, what is tickling your fancy and like, man, I'm going down a rabbit hole right here.
Yeah, I say it's primarily around the limitations of like the common use or application of like neuro-based training. Wrestling little light pods that stick up and playing Pong on a screen. I'm wrestling with the applicability and transferability of that type of training. So I'm looking into kind of taking a principles-based approach to what it is those things are actually doing mechanistically, like working, especially in sports with high rates of like CTE and concussions, head trauma, things like that. There's been like a very aggressive marketing strategy towards these new implements, and I'm questioning them very critically from a principles-based approach and understanding of neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. So that's, and I haven't made any like concrete conclusions yet, but I have my reservations. So that's really where I'm interested in, is like, because everything needs to be contained, and the free market will push it until someone contains it, right? Like Bosu balls, and there's an application for them certainly, but it's not as broadly applied. Foam rollers, right? There's an application for them if you understand mechanistically how they work, but it's not in the way that most people think, right? So I feel like this is kind of, for me, the frontier that I'm at in understanding these applications, because I wouldn't say I'm an early adopter of training styles. Like when something emerges and I have an increasing body of work with the way that I look at training, and like basically as it's set for my worldview, I have a growing body of evidence that I'm less wrong than I used to be in this direction. So just with the prevalence of these tools, honestly, like brought forth by athletes that I work with, like, oh, like this looks cool. Like, yeah, but so do Crocs, and you're not going to get any work done with that either. So like, let's not wear Crocs when we train, and let's not go tapping screens with our finger because you play football for a living and not Dance Revolution. So, so that's really what's interesting me lately, is the unchecked emergence of like neuro-based training, and starting to draw lines to very simple training principles that will in fact be more neuro-based. Like, it's all neuro-based, but you need to understand the nervous system. Like, if you don't know the difference between the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum, I don't want you playing whack-a-mole with red light, green light, right? Because I think it fails to recognize the original point that we talked about. It fails to recognize the amount of sensory input that is in a game, like the speed at which you have to make decisions, the number of decisions that you have, like, are possible to make. That is almost like neurologically. And again, I don't think that it's all bad. Like, there's some cases where that level of regressed retraining would be useful. But imagine taking someone that can bench 500 pounds and then making them bench the bar. Neurologically, like the input of like red light, green light, it's like, well, what about a defender coming in from the left, a guy coming back from the right, a D tackle, and then there's also 75,000 people in the stands, and the ball's in the air and I need to time my jump to jump higher than these 3 guys that are now on my coverage and maybe get a hand on it, hopefully come down, keep it. Also not like, fall on an outstretched arm, break my pisiform in my wrist, hyperextend my elbow, separate my shoulder, and keep 2 of my feet inside this little white line. But yeah, no, totally, man. Like hit the fucking blue light on the gym wall. Like that's so insane to me. So I'm really trying to figure out quantitatively what the applications of some of these new tools are, because I think a lot of people would be better off like understanding that, hey, when your clients do a lunge, maybe see if they can do it with their head not moving, or like looking at a specific target that's not their damn foot. Like hold a med ball in front of their face when they lunge and watch how shitty they are at lunging, and then tell me how much touching little blue and red lights matter when their whole thing is putting one foot in front of the other. They don't know where the damn foot is when they can't see it. So that's the neuro side to me is like going to be the next frontier. And we rope learn in training circles: insertion, origin, action, bicep, coracoid process, supraglenoid tubercle, radial tuberosity, flex the elbow, supinate the wrist, flex the shoulders. Like, okay, great. When we get to a point where that's a precondition to getting into training, and then when we get into training, we're like, hey, this is what the spinocerebellar tract, this is what a foam roller actually does. Hey, this is what a Theragun actually does. So this is what kinesiotape actually does. That's where I think, so that's where my attention's at. And I hope that the industry follows suit, because that's when you want to talk mechanisms, when you want to be the locksmith and you want to make things happen quickly, right? Like sitting there fumbling, looking for your keys. And you want to be the dude with the ice pick and the credit card that just boom, gets in there. Because like we said earlier, making better decisions faster, that's how you're going to make your bread. So those better changes happen at the level of motor learning. The peripheral physiological adaptation falls almost the wayside. So yeah, neuro stuff, I guess in short, is what I'm interested in.
Great callback on the locksmith.
What we do is what we do.
But since we're on this topic too, like maybe, and I usually don't do these, but I'm interested from you, like the overrated, underrated right now in your mind, when you're like, what's some stuff that you're just like, oh my God, like we're talking about this again, overrated, or certain things that's like, we are not talking about this and this is absolutely underrated. That just said that pops to your mind,
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I'll tell you what's underrated: original thought, overrated contrarian thought. I think that's really, that's my issue across the board, is like, it's like watching Crossfire on like Fox or CNN 10 years ago. It's like the guy in the red corner says this, the guy in the blue corner says that. That's all the time we have for today. It's like, what? Like there's no creativity, there's no risk anymore to like go out and like look to explain something differently. Like the dude that, people used to think that gut ulcers were caused by stress, and a guy was like, no, I'm pretty sure it's H. pylori. And they're like, fuck you, it's stress. I don't know if they said that, but he was like, okay. And then he just drank a vial of H. pylori and gave himself gut ulcers. And he goes, hey, I think I got something over here. Now we know that ulcers have to do with H. pylori, right? So it's just like, I think underrated is like the conviction it takes to have original thought and start thinking outside, or thinking even like having a metacognition of why it is you think the way you think, and then maybe coming up with a thought that's not, and I'm not saying like, some things aren't well established, like, hey, gravity's pretty good. I'm not saying like you go unify all of the forces or anything like that, but like, there are things that are contentious, but come up with your own viewpoint as to why it is, and really just come up with it in a manner that which, if your client asks you, you can explain it to them, and then either do the thing or not, right? Because too many people just take a stance of like, well, so-and-so says this, so I agree with him. Okay. Or so-and-so says this, so I'm going to like make a post about the opposite thing. It's like being contrarian doesn't mean you're original. Right. So I think that's my biggest like meta gripe, is just like, underrated original thought, overrated being contrarian.
Well, I mean, and to that point, I definitely want to finish, because I said I wanted to start the show, or should I say finish the show, talking about, career in this industry. And, I know overarching the word success, but like, look, we talked about at the beginning, what would you feel have been some of the things that, you can look back now and go like, look, here's what I think are some of the things that it takes. And I mean, anybody that follows you knows that like you're on a crazy schedule. And I feel you on that, man. But it's like, you know, if you're, and I'm sure people ask you too, but like, if you're talking to folks and go, listen, guys, you know, fill in the blanks. Here's what you say. These are some things, some principles that, you know, will create a successful career in this space. Like, what's some of those things that you would share?
Yeah. Work for free. I mean, do it for the experience. Don't do it for the credit. There's so many stories that you and I could sit back and, you know, at the end of a workout or something, just tell stories that the rest of the world will never get to know. And it's like, that was the thing, like, and maybe it starts from intentions. My whole thing getting into this was to impress people that no one has ever heard of. Like, I got into this because of Charlie Francis. I got into this because of Charles Poliquin, right? Like, I got into this for people that even now, especially now, when you say these names to people, they're like, who? You're like,
wow.
Man, like, yeah. But so, I mean, for me, everything is a good story. So I think too many people do it for the credit, and they don't do it for the experience. And it's like, man, you know, and me of all people, and not to be, you know, too overt or obtuse, but like, of all people, to sit around and just have a podcast where we just obnoxiously name names of like people that we worked with. We've not done that once, by the way, which is like, I know a little bit about like your roster, and it's like, that's where people do, like, what, I don't care about that, man. Like, I care about like having dinner with people that are high achievers and they just happen to be in sports. Like, I care that I get the phone call that's like, yo, man, like, I'm hurting, like, can you come up? Can you fly in? Like, that's the fun part. It's just like, but act accordingly. And like, that's how you get to those places. So it's like people who come in with the phones blazing and they're posting everything. It's like, yeah, man, the best stories are not on Instagram. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something like strategically, and it's hard to say strategically because it has to come from like a genuine place. Like, I don't want you to like strategically be authentic. Like, that doesn't really go hand in hand. But I think that's, if you ask yourself that question and have like an honest appraisal of why you're doing it, like, are you doing it for the credit? Are you doing it for the experience? If you do it for the experience, you'll end up getting whatever enough. I mean, I think enough credit. Like, fuck it, no one should follow me on it. I find it ridiculous that people follow me on Instagram, or like will come up to me like, oh, like I follow, like, well, I talk about working out. Like, they could like follow a cat page or something. Like, I don't really, or desserts with Nutella in it. Like, this is ridiculous. So I think that would be like an overarching principle. And there's like things that fall out from like working for free. Fuck, I work for free as much as I can afford. And luckily now I can work for free more because I'm living off the backs of the benefits of working for free for so long. So I can continue to do that. I think that's where you should be pushing your business to and for, is like, get it to a point where, you know, you have enough, you gain experience way faster because you get way more use cases, you get way more, you know, you get way more bodies to look at. So you actually can provide more value, and you can charge that where it's possible. But I remember someone, I was speaking at a school once, and someone kind of scoffed at that, like a kid. I was like, all right, like, tell me about it, man. And he's like, if you're good at something, you should never do something for free or whatever. Like, I looked at him dead set in the eye. I'm like, yeah, I saw that Batman movie too, kid. What do you know? Right? It's like, what are you, Heath Ledger? Like, get the fuck out of here. Like, you just like, no, you should 100% do it for free, because that's how you get better, you stupid fuck. Oh, so mad. But it's like, yeah, do it for free. Like, you know, coach people for free. And it's like, don't devalue service, but you look at it as a way to add value to your service. So that I think would be my two major ones. Like, do it for the credit, or do it for the experience. Don't do it for the credit, and work for free as much as you can afford.
See, that's why I love that I asked you that question, man, because look, there's going to be a lot of people listening to this, and like, I'm glad that you like share why, because it's the same thing. I remember you probably heard Don tell this story, but you know, was talking to a coach, and he's like, I charge $600 a session, you know, like, and it's like, now you charge less and train more people. What? It's like, dude, you got 4 clients. Like, how are you going to get more experience? How are you going to spread the word more? How are you going to impact more people? How are you get more referrals, more word of mouth? How are you going to, you know, and it's, I mean, you can go on and on and on, but it's the same thing. But the reason I ask is for people that, you know, I respect, they're doing great work in industry, that you start seeing these, you know, threads going through, so that hopefully people are like, fuck, like maybe there's something to this. Right. And that's why I like bringing it up, because hopefully there's enough of it to where it clicks for somebody, goes like, all right, let me fucking do it this way that they're talking about. Maybe they know something. Shit, they've been around for, you know, like, and you do it. And then once you do it, you'll get a lot more than more business. You'll get what you said, for the experiences and the way that you feel when you do it, which I feel, has kept me in this game for a long time. And I feel like I'm a newbie because like I'm as fired up as ever doing this shit, and I'm grateful for it. And I'm definitely grateful for having you on the show. And I'm fucking excited to have you here and to May. Because listen, if you're listening to this and some of this is like, now imagine like 2 days of this with this guy. So it's gonna be fire. May 27, 28, Seattle, Pre-Script level 1. If you're not signed up, you better sign up. But hey, brother, that was, this phenomenal. I really actually hope that like we got to sync up beyond when you're here in Seattle. We gotta sync up on some trips to where I think at this point in time we've only clanged and banged together one time at Don's place years ago. We're gonna have to change that.
Definitely, man. I appreciate you having me on.
My pleasure, man. Have a great one.
Thank you.